This talk is called Sins of the Classroom, and in some ways it will be the practical application of some of the stuff we talked about yesterday in covenant discipline. So there'll be feet on it, and we'll go through some practical examples and so forth. But let's pray, and then we'll get going. Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you that you've given us life and breath. Pray that you'd help us to redeem the time this morning. Grant us wisdom. Pray that you'd protect us on every side. Pray that you would fill us with a love for our students and for our kids at home, and a real biblical balance as we seek to discipline them, love them, bring them up so that they're followers of you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so very quickly, a brief review, because you need to know how I'm going to attack different sins that you're going to see or that you've seen in your classroom if you've taught at all. And the plan of attack is this. Our whole life is simply an exercise in knowing God, loving God, and imitating God. Right? So we're copycats, is what it comes down to. Faithfulness in the Christian life has to do with copying God. And it's no different if you're trying to love your wife than it is if you're trying to discipline your classroom. You're trying to be a faithful copycat. And some things that we identified that we see God doing in particular is He teaches, He trains, and He blesses and curses. Okay, so He teaches His law, He presents what His expectations are to His covenant people. And again, you see yourself as following after Him. There you are. You need to present what your expectations are to your classroom, to your students. He trains, which means He prepares them a way of escape in the midst of temptation. Or He, a plain old way of saying it is He practices with them. He practices them obeying His commands. And the third thing is He blesses for obedience and curses for disobedience. And so what we'll do is we'll take that paradigm and then just walk into the classroom and talk about a few different scenarios, a few different sins that are pretty common to man, pretty common in the elementary in particular, and I'm finding pretty common in the secondary as well. So anyway, discipline as imitation. Second thing is ground rule that's really important for us to remember is that discipline is love. This comes from Proverbs 13:24. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly or disciplines him diligently. And so this is something that we need to have on the front of our minds because sometimes we have it all upside down and backwards, which is simply the fact that a teacher that loves his or her students is going to discipline them. Parents who love their kids are going to spank them. And at the right time, in the right place, with the right look on their face, all the right things have to be in place. But discipline, godly discipline administered according to the Scriptures, is love. It's not hatred. And again, we just have that messed up. And so I want that to be in the front of our minds. Last thing, last ground rule is that public offenses should have some public consequences. This comes from Proverbs 21:11, where it says, "When the scoffer is punished, the naive becomes wise." And you will have, to one degree or another, all three of those different categories of people in your classroom, right? There are scoffers, there are naive, and there are wise in your room. And a scoffer is a person who comes in to the classroom or comes into the school and wants to push buttons, wants to stir up dissension, wants to get a laugh by being rude, is trying to get away with as much as he possibly can. And he's scoffing, he's mocking. And again, you may not have a scoffer that's on the Richter scale way over an extreme. You're a classical Christian school after all. But there will be scoffers that you have in your classroom or kids that scoff in your classroom that you'll have to deal with. And there are naive kids, lots of naive kids nowadays who come in and they're the kids who come into your classroom and they're just watching. They're not necessarily a scoffer, and they're not necessarily wise. They're pliable, right? They're very easy to lead astray, or they could be led toward faithfulness, but they're just there, and they're ready to follow whatever moves. And then you'll have some wise kids in your classrooms as well. Wise students come into your classroom, they sit down, they've got their pencil ready, it's sharp, they're poised, and they're ready to go. And all you have to do is say, go, and they're going to run for you, right? And they sit in that classroom, they see you, and they've had their dad explain to them that, his shadow is behind you as the classroom teacher. They're going to respect you the same way that they respect their father. They're going to say, yes, ma'am, or yes, sir, and they're just ultra dependable, right? Those are wise kids that are in your classroom. And so when you have this dynamic of people that you're dealing with in a school or in a classroom situation, you want to think biblically about the kids that you have and realize that if you don't, back to this text, when the scoffer is punished, the naive becomes wise. You don't want the scoffer to go unpunished, because if the scoffer goes unpunished, the naive doesn't become wise. And I'm usually always thinking about elementary examples of this, but this past year I did more with the junior high and high school as well, and so we had this sort of thing. We had a senior in high school, in a rhetoric class, the teacher passed out a piece of paper having to do with a speech mute assignment and said, you guys, make sure you hold on to this piece of paper. It's really important. You're not going to need it necessarily for a few more weeks, but I really want you to keep track of this thing. It's very important. We took it, and he goes, right? Can you tell what I'm doing back there? It's my outline. Starts doing this in class, right? And like we did, a couple kids around started laughing. They're going, that was the important piece of paper that was, we really needed to keep for later on that year. Well, that's an example of a scoffer in a classroom, okay? And ripping that thing up, and there were naive kids that were giggling and wise kids that were looking at it and thinking, And so again, in this scenario, it's not as though you get out of this situation. You really become more entrenched the older people become. Scoffers, the older scoffers are, the tougher nuts they are to crack. Right? And the less, in some situations, the less hope there is for them. But they're still there, and they're still really useful for the naive in the class, as long as you discipline them. Right? So you've got to let them have it. So when he was expelled from the school, not for this was just the 5th office visit in his little pattern. But when he was expelled from the school, all of the naive kids in the classroom weren't laughing anymore. And all of a sudden they realized, I'm not going to do that. That's not the sort of thing that is acceptable in the school. So that's another principle to keep track of, is that public offenses there should be some kind of public consequence. And it doesn't mean that you have to bring him up in front and flog him in front of the classroom necessarily. But you know how word gets around, right? You need to make sure that you discipline for things and not just say, well, he was having a hard day and love covers a multitude of sins and all that. Okay, so those are some ground rules, and with that, we're just going to dive in, and we're going to tackle some of these sins, and so we'll go through one at a time. The first one is disobedience, and there are two kinds of disobedience. One is called rebellion sometimes, but it's just immediate, it's direct disobedience. And what I mean by this is if you ask a student, there's one, right? If you say, this piece of paper is really important, please hold on to it because we're going to use it in 3 weeks, and he treats it this way, that's direct disobedience. Okay, that's rebellion. If you ask him to please sit down and he says no, that's not hard to spot. I mean, you're dealing with a young person who's not obeying you at that moment. So that's direct disobedience. What do we do in the classroom? What do we do in that kind of a situation? We just send them to the office. My teachers are taxi cab drivers in that scenario. If you have a student that just disobeys you, just straight up the middle, say, all right, well, let's take a walk. They're going to take them down to the office, and then they're done. They don't need to do anything fancy. Second kind of disobedience is subsequent disobedience or delayed. It takes place later on, afterward. And these are usually nickel-dime things like running in the hallway. You talk to the kids about not running in the hallway at the beginning of the year, and 3 weeks later somebody's running in the hallway. Or, please don't chew gum in the classroom. Somebody's chewing gum in the classroom, something like that. And so there's memory that's involved in there, and then obedience. And so what do? Well, we teach Ephesians 6, 1 and 2. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. And we want students to have that memorized, to be able to explain it, and to be able to obey it. And we'll talk to them. Part of what you should do is imagine your classroom and those 4 kids that are really wise, or those 3 kids that you think those are the really wise kids. What have their parents done that's prepared them to be so wise in the classroom? And then ask yourself, could I do some of that in the classroom? Could I talk to all of these students in such a way that they see their father's shadow behind me, and they understand that God cares about how they act in this classroom, and there's direct commands from Him that apply to them as young people in here, and just talk to them about their position before God and what their obligations are. And so that's what we teach. What do you train? Well, we have one classroom rule in the elementary, and it's obey right away, all the way, and with a good attitude every day. Okay, that's the one rule. So you obey right away, which means obedience should be immediate, should be right now. And so if you ask a student to sit down, he's sharpening his pencil, and he's been there for 5 minutes, and you say, "John, please sit down," and John walks in an indirect path by his friend to give him an elbow on the way to his desk, every step that he took from that pencil sharpener toward his friend's desk was a disobedient one, right? When you ask him to sit down, it means you come directly to your desk, sit straight down where you are, and it should be right away, so it's immediate. So you obey right away. All the way means obedience should be complete. And the example I always use is cleaning your room. If you ask your kids to clean their room, you say, "Josiah, will you please go clean your bedroom?" And he stuffs everything underneath the bed or everything in the closet, then it's not complete. Okay, it was a rearrangement of what was going on. But it's right away, all the way, and then with a good attitude simply means obedience should be cheerful. Should be with a yes, sir. You want to hear that they heard the command. As a parent in particular, if you don't require your kids to acknowledge that they've been given a command, then when you need to enforce something, you don't have that positive connection. If they say, "I didn't hear you," then you should say, "Well, then why did you say yes, ma'am?" Okay? If they didn't say yes, ma'am, then maybe they didn't hear you. Maybe there wasn't a clear connection. And so we want a command and then a response, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, and then they would obey, and it's cheerful. So that's the classroom rule. And in the first 2 weeks, we just see the first 2 weeks of school in the elementary as training time, training grounds. And so we're going to waste a bunch of time in the first 2 weeks, because we know that wasting a bunch of time in the first 2 weeks on things like practicing lining up, practicing coming to attention, practicing taking your math book out, practicing walking into the classroom, practicing going into an assembly, all these practicing things that just each time, it's just, write down some curricular objectives on your lesson plan for the first 2 weeks, but then just realize you won't get to hardly any of them, because you're going to be doing all this practice, and what it'll do is it'll set your classroom up in such a way that you're going to be able to fly for the rest of the year. You're going to overtake any sort of little progress you could have made in those first 2 weeks, hand and foot, because you'll be really scooting down the road, and you'll be a finely tuned, well-oiled machine, which is what you want. So what are some examples? I always start off, or used to start off, the 6th grade year by teaching the kids how to come to attention. I thought one thing I want them to know is when I want it silent, when I want their eyes and their ears on me, I need to be able to do something that signals them that I want their attention. And so I don't throw chalk or flip the lights on and off or ding a bell or anything like that. And sometimes in the classroom you're doing some fun activity where they should be talking to each other. You're dissecting a cow heart, or you're taking an engine apart, or some sort of group activity where they should be saying, look, I found the aorta, right? And that sort of conversation is really necessary and important. But you may have found an even better aorta in a different heart, and you want to have them all look at it so you can show it to them, or an AV valve or something like that. And so what I'll do very beginning of the day in 6th grade is I'll tell them how I'm going to bring them to attention. I'll say, all I do in 6th grade is I'm going to say, attention, please. And when I say that, it should just be silent, and every eye should be on me. You guys all have that? And they'll go. And again, just like yesterday, in your head think, no clue. They have no clue what I'm talking about. And even in 6th grade, they really don't get it. And so you say, all right, well, that was my teaching, right? I presented the law, told them what I wanted to do, have them do, and now you've got to train them. So how are you going to train them? Well, do a little hypothetical situation. Say, okay, when I say go, I want you to turn to your neighbor, and I want you to talk. Don't listen to what your neighbor's saying. Just talk to your neighbor. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. Just talk, all right? And then I'm going to bring you to attention, and we'll see how you do. Ready? Go. And they're a little nervous the first day of school. And so they turn and they start talking. And then I'll say, attention, please. Not that loud. I don't shout. And I'm not whispering either, but it's a pretty normal voice. I'll just say, attention, please. And the few kids in the front of the classroom, they're paying attention, the wise kids, they'll stop and they'll look at me. And then it kind of goes, and it's quiet. And then everybody, some of the kids in the back are quiet because everybody else was being quiet, but they didn't necessarily hear me even say that. And then you have to stop, look at them and say, that was terrible. And all of a sudden I think, terrible? Yeah, it's pitiful. Because some of the people in the back didn't even hear me. And there's a few kids that will raise their hand, right? Mr. Whitling, we didn't hear you. I'll say, that was your first mistake. Is you were talking so loud that you couldn't even hear me say, attention, please. And then a kid puts his hand down. He doesn't want to say, maybe he had a different question. I'm not going to ask it, right? He just thinks, okay. But it's a recalibration is what they're going through, right? They're thinking, okay, we thought he was an X and he's a Y now. And so they'll adjust a little bit. But again, like we talked about yesterday, what you want to do is you want to present to them. It doesn't matter which thing you pick. Attention, please, or teach them how to line up, or whatever it is. There are probably a bunch of different things you could do, how to walk into the classroom. What you're doing is you want to present to them what sort of person you are, not all the 18,000 different expectations that you're going to have for them this year. What are you like? And that's really what they want to know, too. They want to know what sort of person is this guy, and then that's going to filter into all of these little hypothetical situations in their mind where they run a thought experiment. If I did this, what would Mr. Whitling do? If I did that, what would Mr. Whitling do? And they'll draw their own conclusions, sometimes stricter than you may actually be. But for the first day of school, that's just fine with me. I'd rather have them think, oh, yeah, he's a little different, than think, oh, yeah, this is a lot of fun, and he doesn't really care about whether he's going to follow through with what he has to say. So you can do a bunch of different little hypotheticals with them, but we do that the first day of school. And so we did it once. I said that was terrible. And if you move on, then what you've done is you've showed them that you have really high standards and that you can't be pleased, and they'll think, boy, I don't really like this. And so you can't just move on with them being terrible. So you'll say, all right, what we've got to do is we're going to try it again. This time, when you hear me say attention, please, boy, it needs to be just right now. Make sure it's silent. Everybody just look at me. Just freeze halfway through your sentence. Ready? Go. And so they'll start talking again. And same thing. I'll say, attention, please. And usually nowadays, on the second time, they'll nail it. Right? Usually 6th graders, it doesn't take a third time. Maybe with 3rd graders it would. But Second time, they'll nail it, just silent. And I'll say, that's exactly the sort of thing I was looking for. Well done. And it was pretty simple, didn't take too much time, but what I want them to see is that I care about what I say, that I'm going to follow through when I give them a command, I'm going to hold them accountable to it, that I can be pleased, and that they need to stay on their toes, which is part of this whole thing. So we teach, we train, and then blessing and cursing. We've talked a little bit about blessing and cursing. Verbal encouragement, if they're doing things well, you should let them know that you're pleased. Second thing, though, having to do with cursing, first 2 weeks of school, we'll do a verbal rebuke alone, instead of even name on the board. It's fine if you put somebody's name on the board, but I think when you're training kids, it's more important that they learn from different scenarios as a class together. And so an example of that is third grade, our big thing was always learning to raise our hand before we spoke. Okay? And if you have somebody who's really excited and interested in what's going on and been homeschooled for 2 years or 3 years before that, and they're used to being able to just talk, I can just talk whenever I want to talk, then we training the first couple of weeks, that's something that we want to learn, is if everybody talks when they want to talk, imagine in here, let's say we were all in a classroom right now, and anybody talked whenever they wanted to talk, it'd be chaos. And so in a group of 20 kids, same sort of thing. They just need to learn protocol. Raise your hand before you speak and be called on as well. And so first 2 weeks, if someone just runs ahead and talks, answers a question or has a little comment, and so they jump into the middle of things, what I'll do is just stop and say, okay, what just happened? And I'll have 17 hands go up. Almost everybody knows what just happened, except for maybe the one who spoke without raising his hand. And he's looking around going, what just happened? And I'll say, what just happened? And somebody raised their hand. Didn't raise his hand before he spoke. Okay, what's the standard? Have to raise your hand before you speak. Okay, what's that called? That's disobedience. Okay, Bill, you got that straight? Okay, make sure you raise your hand before you speak. And again, you could put his name on the board if you want to, but I think the very beginning of the school year, it's more important that he understands that you're going to hold him accountable to the standards that you have in the classroom, and that everybody learns this lesson together. And if you do this for a couple days where it's just a verbal rebuke, you should be gracious, you should be hard on them at the same time. It's this balance. You're not rude and nasty and making them cry over it, although sometimes you don't know what's going to make them cry. So But for a few days, if you do this, what it does is it eliminates any kids that are kind of in between. So if there are naive kids, they learn. They're just going to learn right away. Wise kids are right with you. Naive kids, if there were kids that were halfway mockers, they learn. You only end up with 1 or 2 kids in your classroom that you think, okay, these are my hardened criminals that I just really need to be after this year. Okay? And by hardened criminals, it means the kid has not responded. It's been 3 days, and he's not responded to a verbal rebuke like this. He just does not have the self-control. He hasn't been disciplined or whatever it is, doesn't have the self-control for that to be enough for him. And so for a little pirate like that, then what I would do is call him in at recess, just talk to him and say, it's been 3 days, it's been 4 days, and it seems like a couple times a day I've had to talk to you about speaking without raising your hand. Have you noticed that? He may not have. Say, I see it as a pattern. Do you know what that's called? It's disobedience. And so there are times when teachers are having a problem with a student, one student, and the teacher will come to me and say, what do you think? And I'll say, have you sat down and talked to that student one-on-one and presented the issue to them through your eyes? This is what I'm seeing. This is what it means. When you burp in class, this is what it means. Or when you yawn while I'm teaching, just a big, what that means is, this is really boring. I wish I was somewhere else. I want to go to sleep. It's such a drag in here. Okay, just translate for them what that means, one-on-one, not in a classroom situation or classroom dynamic. And oftentimes that will click, and that'll be the thing that brings them along. And if that doesn't, then you talk to their parents and put their name on the board. They may need a spanking over it. It might be a self-control thing where they've got to figure these things out. But we'll teach, train, bless, and curse. And so that's for disobedience. Again, if it's rebellion or direct disobedience, they just go right to the office. And then you can let your principal take care of it. And then I'm going to pick on teachers as well. So, we always talk about disciplining kids, but what about teachers? Is there ever disobedience in teachers? And you think, wait a minute, I didn't think that was part of this talk. It's good, if you've got these standards for the kids, you should have the same standards or higher ones for yourselves, right? I mean, if you're jumping up and down on obey right away, all the way, and with a good attitude every day, and you go and apply that standard to these little third graders or little sixth graders when you give a command, then it seems reasonable, if that's a godly response in them, it seems reasonable that if your administrator gives you a directive, you should be thinking right away, all the way, with a good attitude every day, right? Lead by example. So let's talk about a few things in that realm. If your administrator does give you a directive, is that the first thing on your mind? Is your first inclination, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am? Or are you trying to kind of dig in and protect your turf so that you don't have to change? Sometimes teachers that have taught for a long time, the hardest thing for them is changing. They don't want to do something different. They've been doing this. It's been successful. They're fine. Change means a lot of work and retooling. And for you, let's say some young administrator is hired to oversee what you're doing, and you've been doing this for years and years and years, and your administrator gives you a directive. I want you to, and you can fill in the blank with whatever you want, I want you to use this new curricular material. The board has decided we're going to do the Shirley method. Okay, is your first response, yes, sir? And it goes deeper than this, because you and I both know that, let's say I was your principal and I asked you to do the Shirley method. I know that a teacher could take a particular textbook and make it faceplant on purpose, right? I know I could do it as a teacher. I could have an administrator tell me, use this in your classroom, and I could say, oh, well, I'll give it a try, and then we'll sit down afterward and evaluate its strengths and weaknesses, right? And I'm thinking, and I know what the weaknesses are going to be. And I could teach that thing in such a way that it didn't work, and I had empirical evidence showing how bad it was in the classroom. Or imagine yourself, what if your administrator gave it to you and you thought, I don't know. But you taught it in such a way that you kind of compensated for the weaknesses that you see in it, and you made it really sing. It's just a tool, right? And you made it really sing. And you sat down at the end of the year and you said, it was successful in these ways, and here are some weaknesses, but I realize it's a tool, and we could go either way on this. And so for yourself, hold yourself to the same standards that you hold your students. Second thing has to do with school policies. Policies seem like really boring things. But, do you have a secondary doctrine policy that we do at Logos that prescribes what doctrine is fair game and what doctrine we just leave to the parents? If you do have a secondary doctrine policy, realize that when you teach for your school, you are promising that you will follow that. You're promising parents that send their kids into your classroom that you're not going to try to tweak with their little secondary doctrine issues in subversive ways or obvious ways. And so you should just be really cleanly obedient to school policies that you have. Another example is dress. Do you have guidelines for teacher dress? Male teachers, are you required to wear a tie, coat and tie every day? Do you do so cheerfully? Ladies, do you dress modestly? Or are you the sort that needs to have your administrator talk to you and say, look, if I see lines on the back of your blouse, which means it's being pulled against your back really tight, that's too tight. Right? Save that for the high school kids. Your administrator has enough problems dealing with modesty issues with the high school kids without teachers with the same problems. Length of skirt. If you have modesty issues with the lengths of your skirt, you should look at what the standards are for the students, and you should be well within those. right? You're an example for the rest of those kids in the classroom. And so follow those guidelines that you have. Let's see. Oh, last thing. Has to do with staff meetings. If you have a staff meeting, what is your disposition when you come into a staff meeting? Right? Especially one in which you may be discussing some new thing. Right? New idea, new curriculum, whatever it happens to be. Do you come in thinking, obey right away, all the way, and with a good attitude every day? We're on the same team. We're going to work together. We're going to figure this out. And I'm going to be gracious and kind. And I'm going to make this meeting go as well as I possibly can. Or do you come in, kind of plant a stake, take a step, plant a stake. Take a step, plant a stake. I'm going to try not to move too far and, just kind of dig in deep. So that's for teachers. All right, dishonesty. Let's keep moving. Dishonesty primarily seen in wandering eyes during the math test, slips of paper cascading to the floor during the history final, light pencil markings on the desk during the spelling test. It is striking in one sense how common cheating is, and in another sense we realize that we're all a bunch of sinners, and so that's just one of those sins that comes along with being fallen. But I think one of the worst situations we can get ourselves into is where we are, which is in high schools nowadays. The best and the brightest kids oftentimes are the kids that have cheated the most. They are almost never caught. And there have been polls done of the who's who kids. They always poll the who's who kids and ask them, did you ever cheat while you're in high school? It was like 85, 95% of them say, oh yeah, of the cream of the crop. And then they ask them, were you caught? 95% of them say, never. And then they ask those kids' parents, do you think your kids ever cheated during high school? And 75, 80% of the parents say, not my kids. Okay, and so what we have is a widespread sin problem and no accountability. Nobody's being caught for it, and parents that don't think their kids would do that. And so what do we do about the whole thing? Well, number one is we acknowledge that we're all sinners, and this is a common temptation in schools. We're a school, after all. You give tests, and so one of the temptations that comes along with tests is keeping your eyes on your own paper. And one of the lessons that elementary school kids in second and third grade need to learn in particular, and that's where our cheating, the number of offenses for cheating in second and third grade just outstrips any other grade. Okay, it's second and third grade. Well, why? Why would it be in second grade? Well, life becomes more academic in second grade, right? There are more tests. There are more real letter grades. And so there's more accountability. These kids are being held accountable. It's not a group project when you're doing a test. They've got to learn to keep their eyes on their own paper. And I think it's indicative that things are going well if you have those offenses in second and third grade. I think if all of a sudden those go away, you should think, what's going on? Why aren't kids cheating in second and third grade anymore, the administrator says. I'm concerned about our school. And I would be concerned about our school because what I would want to know is the teacher paying attention anymore? Do we have a new second grade teacher who's just letting this go? Because realize that the patterns you instill in second, third, fourth grade are going to be roads that these kids run down as they become older. And the stakes become higher and higher and higher. But if you're used to this sort of thing, if it's all right, I just glanced. Right? It was just that. Now, are you going to send a kid to the office for doing this? All I did was, I didn't even turn my head. Well, you better be prepared to send them to the office for that. Okay? And so what it comes down to is you need to, again, teach, train, bless, and curse. So what do? Everybody needs to know the rules of the game, first of all. Parents, there are a lot of parents who will freak out if you tell them, during a test, if your child glances over at somebody else's paper, it's going to be an office visit. It's going to be a 0 on the test. It might be a spanking. Because they'll think, well, did you document it? How many answers did she take? Why not just mark the answers wrong that she cheated on, and go and ask the cheater, how many did you cheat on? how many is she going to say? So the other thing is, little people this age, sometimes they're not cheating, right? 2nd, 3rd grade, they're not cheating. They're checking to see, I'm on number 7. I wonder if he's that far. I wonder if he's on number 7. And so they're looking over to compare and see. Well, that little person needs to know what's at stake. I mean, you do not compare to see which answer they're on in the middle of a test. And so what do you teach? Exodus 20:15, thou shalt not steal. Ephesians 4:28, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. Hard work is the antidote to stealing. And students need to know, and parents nowadays too, that cheating on a test is stealing an answer and then lying to your teacher saying that it's my own, right? So if I'm taking someone else's answer and writing it on my paper, and then I turn it in with my name at the top of that paper, it's theft and it's a lie. Now, what if your little person's just checking, they're not trying to steal an answer and they're not writing it down on their paper, then it's direct disobedience, which is still an office visit, right? So, but what you can't do is paint yourself into a corner where you've got to read their heart and figure out, is he comparing to see where he is, or is he trying to take an answer? You want to be really objective. You want your standards to be clear and preparatory. And so you just say, your eyes must be on your own paper, or your eyes must be on a safe spot. Look at the ceiling if you want. You can look at the teacher if you want. But usually the paper is the safest bet, is where you should look during a test. And if you ever look on anybody else's desk or test during the test time, that's just going to be handled as cheating. And it is going to be an office visit. It is going to be a 0 on whatever the test was. And in our schools, it depends. If it's your second time, you're definitely going to get a spanking. If it's your first time and you make things right away and you don't twist it or spin it or lie about it afterwards, then it's just going to be a call home. We're going to let you know. But this is something, I went into the secondary this past year thinking, okay, what's different about the elementary and the secondary? And there are enough kids coming in through the side and enough kids that are just sinful that cheating's an issue in the secondary as well. Right? We had a young lady cheat on a chemistry final exam this year. Talk about stupid, which sin always is. The chemistry final exam, she looks on another girl's paper, and a girl behind her saw her look, and the girl who saw her look talked to her after class and said, you were looking on her test during the test. Do you want to go tell Mr. Struble, or should I? And so she went and turned herself in, got a 0 on her chemistry final, which we thought was going to make it so she didn't get any credit for that whole semester. Right? It'd be a whole semester, boom, bring her down below 70%. And so she turned herself in, got a 0 on that. But it's an issue that is not just 2nd and 3rd grade, but that's when some of these things need to be begun. So anyway, teaching and training. So what do you train? Eyes and wise spot. Make sure they know what temptations will come up. Another thing is, I'll have my kids, once they stand up to turn in their test, you're done. Okay? Because this happens, right? If you've been around for a while, stand up, take a walk to Mr. Whitling's desk, and on the way, how many papers are on the way, right? And nobody's going like this. I mean, you're not... Some kids might try, but I'll just say, look, you comb over everything very, very carefully. As soon as you stand up, you're done. So if it comes to you, as soon as you get to my desk, just turn it in, because you're done at that point. Same sort of thing, a little trick for teachers. If you're grading a math test and there's an answer, there's a blank where there's not an answer, just put a line through that. Put a line through that box, because it's a real common temptation for a child to write in the answer afterwards, or if you're the type that writes the answer in, you just write the answer in. That might be helpful. But there are little things you can do to help hold people accountable and not leave the door open. We had a young man years ago I always remember this story, who we training, again, you have to have all these things in place before you give your first test. Because you give that first test, somebody cheats on it, they end up in the office, I come back to the teacher and say, okay, well, have you taught and trained about keeping your eyes on your own paper? Because when I call this little person's parents, I'm going to tell them, this teacher has taught and trained on this. We've been practicing it for the last week, and here's what happened in that context. So anyway, we had this little guy, I think it was third grade, and I was talking to him about eyes in a wise spot. Keep your eyes in a wise spot. And I was giving a spelling test. And so I'd give a word, I wrote a word, and then he'd go. And then I gave another word, and he'd do the same thing. He'd look straight up. And I looked up, and the kids around him were looking up. And it took me 3 or 4 words, I think, until it finally clicked. And I thought, eyes in a wise spot. He's got his eyes in a wise spot. And everybody around him was just thinking, what is he looking at? But that's boys for you, right? I mean, all of a sudden you see a boy who's trying to be faithful, and you're going to think, what are you doing? And he'll think, isn't this what you meant? By that. And so your choices are, right? You can just smush the whole thing and say, dummy, idiot. Or with boys, you've got to separate the wheat from the chaff, always. And so you look at it and say, okay, here's what was really good about that. You were obeying. I could see every word. I mean, your eyes were just they were in a spot, that's for sure. But here's the thing, Here's a better place. Just look on your paper the whole time. Afterwards, look on your paper. And so we'll practice that. But they need to practice keeping their eyes on their own paper, eyes in a wise spot. And we've talked about curses. What do you do? It's an automatic office visit, and so we'll deal with that. Blessings, be a little leery. Just because you haven't seen any cheating going on over the past 4 weeks doesn't mean that you necessarily should throw a pizza party for the class. So you do need to be, as a teacher, you need to be active. If you're the type of teacher that sits down at your desk and corrects papers while the kids are taking a test, you are providing a real temptation to them. There's no accountability. And so as a teacher, it's not that you're trying to catch them all the time, that you're really uptight and you're wanting to catch these kids because they're all a bunch of cheaters down deep. It's not that at all. It's that you love these kids, and so you should position yourself in a place where you can see everybody's face at the very least, right? You want to be seeing everybody's face. If somebody's looking at you too much, you should be looking at them a lot, right? Somebody spend a lot of time looking at you, I'll just look at them, I'll smile. Come over and stand next to them and kind of look. That's a cue for me. I need to go over and spend some time with this little person. And every now and then you should take a walk through the desks. Just walk through. My mom, when she was I think she was in junior high, she had a big test. I think it was a history test. And apparently she said she had never done this before, but wrote a few dates down on a little slip of paper and brought them into the test. And it was one of those frenzied, sinful moments where you're not thinking because you don't want to think. And so you're sinning quickly. And then she was in the midst of the test, had the slip of paper under her skirt, between her skirt and her leg, at her desk, and was terrified that she was guilty, right? Hadn't used it, but had it there, and was sitting there just nervous, probably failing the test because her nerves were so bent out of shape. And for some reason, the teacher stood up from his desk and walked toward her, just walking toward her. And the closer he got, the more she started shaking. And as soon as he got to her desk, the paper slipped out and onto the floor, right in front of him. I just said, oh, look at that, the providence of God. Picked it up, and there were the dates. And didn't do anything about it, apparently. Didn't say anything, just picked it up and looked at her for a minute. And that was enough to melt her into the carpet for the rest of her life. Never want to do anything like that again. But the thing you realize is there's cheating that's going on, and your job is to love kids by holding them accountable and realize that one instance of you sending somebody to the office can change their course, right? Can be a blessing to them, the sort of thing that they look back on 40 years from now, 50 years from now, and say, that's something that made me different from that point on. And so you should be hungry to love your kids that way and to hold them accountable. All right, how about in teachers? Are there times when dishonesty is a temptation for us? I think in one realm there can be. If your students ask you a question and you really don't know the answer to it, do you ever bluff them? And pretend like you really know the material so well that it's incomprehensible to them, your explanation of it. Well, that's lying, right? You should just be straight up the middle. If you don't know the answer, you should say, that's a great question. I really don't know, and I'm going to find out tonight, and we'll get back to it tomorrow. We'll follow up on this whole thing. When your administrator asks if you've completed all of your grade level objectives, do you... at the end of the year, right, we'll sit down and have a face-to-face, each teacher with me, and I'll say, okay, did you complete all of your grade level objectives? And they knew that question was going to be asked, and so they had time to think about it, comb through everything. Do you fudge a little bit to make it not sound as bad? You should hold yourself to the same standard that you want your kid. Remember, we're sending him to the office for this, right? Glance over there. So for you, have the same standard for yourself. I did not cover these 2 objectives, and I don't have any good reason. I just missed it somehow. And so be very scrupulous with yourself. Or, administrator comes to you and says, okay, last Friday was F day. Did you contact these parents and let them know that their child had a grade that was in the low 70s or below? Did you contact them? And you say, yes, sir. And in your mind you're thinking, yes, sir, I'm going to contact them right after our discussion, right? Well, that's lying to him. And so there's a covenantal tie between your sins and your children's sins, your sins and your students' sins. And so for these sorts of things, again, you should be scrupulously honest. Be hard on yourself. And there will be a connection, a direct connection between your kids. All right, discontent is the next thing. Otherwise known as complaining. Most often announced by a roll of the eyes, sigh of the breath, or a whining moan. What do we teach? Then Job arose and rent his mantle, and shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground, and worshipped, and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. That's Job 1:20. Ephesians 5:15, give thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then Philippians 2:14, do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars. And so the thing that we train is that everything that's on your plate is there because God did the cooking. Okay, so whatever assignments you have to do today, the disposition, you just imitate Job. Whatever you got for dinner, you say, thank you, Lord, and you eat it. Right? So be grateful for what you have, and then eat it. And there are times when you'll have to practice, because there are. I remember I taught 4th grade Latin for 1 year, and I don't know if it's like this every year in 4th grade, but the 4th graders had this propensity to want to correct the teacher. So, if I would I meant Wednesday and I said Tuesday, boom, there'd be all these hands up, just all over me, and I thought, man, alive. And it was like they just fed off of it. They're looking for any sort of mistake that you might make. And I saw this for a couple days. It just took a couple days, and I thought, whoa. And talked to the classroom teacher, and the teacher said, yeah, you wouldn't believe it. Because the same sort of thing with me. And so I decided, all right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start making mistakes every other sentence. And I'm going to talk to these kids about how to deal with it when the teacher does a slip of the tongue and just says something that's, that's just wrong. It's not that important, but it's just they missed the day or whatever it is. And so I came in and talked to the kids about thankfulness and respectfulness, and I said, if I make a mistake in something I say, I just want you to smile. You just smile at me, stay right with me. And if you put your hand up, that means you're being a little whiner and a complainer and a nitpicker. So don't do that. You just smile. And I said, there are going to be times over the next week where you will not believe how many mistakes I make in my teaching. And just realize I'm always doing it on purpose from now on. And then just go in, and then I'd start saying things on the wrong day, and then watching them, and they're looking at me and they're thinking, and then they just start smiling, and they'll smile, and then that's our communication. You caught the little slip up, you smile at me. And by training them, and it only took a week or so, by training them, they became a really delightful class. They were a pain in the neck initially. They became a really fun class because they had grown up a little bit, and they saw that these little mistakes that don't make any difference are things that love should just cover a multitude of and just deal with it graciously. But they really had to be trained because they were sharks. For some reason, they just were really deadly about this whole thing. And so it became kind of a fun project for us to chip away at. Another thing that might be helpful here is be wary of letting kids vote for how much they like the assignment or dislike the assignment. And I don't mean by raising their hands, but you've all, it's really encouraging as a teacher to give this cool assignment and have all the kids say, yes. Right? But if you let that culture develop where they get to say yes when they really like it, well, then how would you express your opinion if you didn't like it? And if you as a teacher allow for that sort of cheering and booing, then you'll get what you'll reap what you sow. And so for me, I'll just tell the kids when I give an assignment, should be a smile on your face. When I hand a paper, I always love it when they say thank you. You're handing a test out, right? You've got this huge test, Shakespeare test at the end of the year, and you think this is a killer test. This is a really good test, and it's really hard. And you hand it to this person, and she'll look up at you and say, thank you. And that's the sort of picture that we want to see. Them grateful for the chance to take this test. Them grateful for the chance to write this essay, whatever it happens to be. But they need to have you talk to them about it. Right? Oftentimes our problems are because we're experiencing this thing in the classroom, and we see the problem, and we don't know how to fix it. We'll just go in and talk to them about it. Say, here's what I've been seeing. I've allowed you to cheer or to boo. It's my fault. Here's what the Word of God says about this whole thing. Here's what our plan is from now on. And then we're going to practice until we're really good at it. And just be straightforward. Talk to them like adults sometimes, and they'll respond very well. There are times when the students are especially diligent and cheerful, and I will bless them for that. If kids do complain, then sometimes we'll give them more. We'll say, well, it's obvious to me that we need more practice writing 5-paragraph essays because of this response that we just had. And so instead of doing 1 this week, we're going to do 2. And in fact, we'll probably do this every week, that there's not a really pleasant response to doing it, because it just shows me that we need more practice on the whole thing. All right, let's move on to teachers. And complaining. Do you ever complain when your administrator makes a decision differently than you would have? Right? I mean, let's say this administrator wanted to get something done or a direction that he wanted to go, and he allowed for a time of discussion. I said, thank you very much for everybody's input. Here's where we're going. This is the plan. At that point, when he says this is the plan, then your answer is, yes, sir, we're going to make this work. Right? Unless you get to the point where you think, this man is causing me to sin. And in that sort of a scenario, you should quit. Right? Or let him know that the stakes are high enough where you're thinking about quitting. But if it's not at that level, then it's just boom. You keep your eyes on the target, and yes, sir, and make this thing really sing. Okay, dissension. Dissension is seen in the classroom when there's strife or discord, quarreling and wrangling among students. If you've ever had personality conflict, right? These two kids just don't work well together. Well, I'm going to make them sit next to each other, right? Because as soon as you start accommodating kids that don't get along, you're not going to have enough seats in your classroom to keep everybody away from everybody else, because they're all a bunch of sinners. And so maybe in an extreme case, I would do something different. But usually my default response is, I'd really like to see those two kids sit together until they're out of the woods on this whole issue. Then I'll move them. Right? But I want to see progress between the two of them. Then we'll move things after that. But if you're always moving, that sin is still there. It's just not being dealt with at the time. So anyway, what do you teach? Proverbs 6:16 through 19. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are swift to rush to evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a man who stirs up dissension among brothers. And we make a distinction in the elementary, at least, between major offenses and minor offenses. Kids need to know what to do with themselves and how to interpret what's going on. And so we'll talk to them about the difference between major offenses and minor offenses. A minor offense is when someone steps on your foot when you're getting into your locker, right? They step on your toe. Little people need to know what to do. Do you punch them? Do you go tell the teacher, he stepped on my toe? They need to know, okay, stepped on my toe, minor offense. For a minor offense, love covers a multitude of sins. If his elbow is on my desk, and you've got this sweet little girl, and she just has this one little desk, and this big fat boy next to her that can't keep track of his body parts, and he's, just kind of spreading out, and she's, huddling over here. Well, if their elbow's on your desk one time, it's a minor offense. Love covers a multitude of that. Somebody cuts in line in front of you. Love covers a multitude of that. Now, if there's a pattern of that, which means 3 or more times, somebody steps on your toe, and it's been 3 days in a row they step on your toe, right? Or 3 days in a row she's cutting in front of you. Or this kid, it's all day long he's got his elbow on my desk. Then if there's a pattern of minor offenses, you talk to the person and say, will you please move your elbow off my desk? And if you don't feel comfortable talking to him, you can come talk to the teacher, and the teacher will talk to him. But if there's a pattern of those minor offenses, then say something, right? Go to your brother in love and say something. And if it doesn't change now, talk to the teacher, and we'll make the change happen. Okay, it's going to be fixed. If there's a major offense, major offenses are cheating in the classroom, a fight, open disrespect to teachers or parents, lying, stealing, any high-level issue, and a child witnesses it, the response is, go to that person and say, you can tell Mr. Whitling, or I will. Right? That's our default mode. I love you enough where I'm going to require that this is made right, and here's your chance. You can make things right on your own, and I'm going to go with you, or I'm going to just go and tell him, regardless of whether you'll come with me or not. And it's not that you love a person if they're committing minor offenses or minor sins. Love covers a multitude of sins. And you hate them or get them in trouble if they're doing major ones. Both are love, right? Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. It's just that in minor offenses, it really could be an accident. It could be something that they're not being intentionally nasty at all. The major offenses, it's not an accident. As far as you can tell, right? It's just straight up the middle trouble. And loving them means holding them accountable in that particular situation. And so we talk about those things again. First 2 weeks of school, that's part of them trying to navigate the classroom. What do I do when this happens? How do I respond to it? Young people also need instruction on sins of the tongue. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but Proverbs 17:4 says, an evildoer gives heed to false lips. A liar listens eagerly to a spiteful tongue. And young ladies in particular in the upper elementary grades and certainly in the secondary need to know that it's a sin not only to gossip, but it's a sin to be a receptacle of gossip. So in other words, if you're the one who's saying, oh really? Tell me more, you're part of the problem. And you're not just listening and kind of objectively saying, boy, this isn't good, she shouldn't be saying that. If she shouldn't be saying that, you should tell her so. Or you should change the subject right then so that you keep her from temptation. And if you're a guy, you should say, hey, shut up, you shouldn't be saying that sort of thing. And it's not because guys can't be subtle. It's that young men don't receive subtle rebukes well. Right? They need a 2x4. And then they'll think, are you talking about me? Whereas a lady in a conversation, you could have a lady gossiping about her husband in a conversation, and her friend all of a sudden turns it and starts talking about what she's going to cook for dinner tonight, which is a subtle way of rebuking a friend. Just change the subject right now and don't talk about what she was talking about at all. And ladies are subtle enough to think, it's not what I was talking. Whereas a guy will say, hey, that wasn't what I was saying. What I was trying to tell you was... and so they need to be told, you big sissy, stop whining about your mom and go and catch the football. Right? And they'll think, okay. And they're best friends for the rest of their lives. All right. So we better move on because the time's running out. So let's hit dawdling. And by dawdling, I mean kids that are just sitting there. They could be sweet as anything, not trying to cause any trouble, but they're just not pedaling very hard at all. Give them that assignment. They've got their pencil in their hand, looking at their paper. They're happy. And after 15 minutes, they don't even have their name on it. You're walking by and you think. So for that sort of a situation, what we do is first thing is talk to that individual one-on-one. If it's not a public issue where they're slowing the class down, and it's not a big flashy thing, we're just going to deal with them one-on-one and say, here's the deal, you're not redeeming the time. And again, there are passages on your outline and so forth. But we're going to talk to that individual, and we're going to work with them for a few days. But if we see this as a pattern that's developed, then we're going to talk to his parents right away. Because what you don't want to do, here's the scenario. If he's doing that in your class, he's probably doing it more than you realize, right? Because you can't always see the fruits of it. You're reading a lit book. You don't know how many pages he's read necessarily after a half an hour. What it does is it translates into tons of homework, right? He's got tons of homework because the way we work it is whatever you don't get done in the classroom, you're going to finish at home. It's going to be due tomorrow. And so his parents see you as the bad guy. And they think this teacher is assigning hours of homework. And they'll start to, it's low level at first, but then it keeps going on and it gets worse and worse. You don't want to sit down for a parent-teacher conference and have this parent come in ready to eat you alive. And that's when you first mentioned that, I'm not sure that your son's really using his class time very wisely at all. That should have been a conversation that happened the second week, third week of school, so that they realize what this is all about, why it's resulting in so much homework. And don't allow kids to save their math homework to do with their mother at home tonight, right? Or their classwork. There are young men in particular, and maybe it's their mom's fault, but there are young men who would much rather sit next to their warm, cuddly mom and do their math assignment than work on it on their own at school. Why? Well, it's fun, it's warm, there's interaction, she helps when I don't know the answers, it's not as hard. It's this cozy time. We've had kids say, well, I'm saving this for my mom tonight. Say, no, you are not. You get that thing done right now, and you leave your mother alone. That's why she sent you to school, right? Is because this has been a problem. So, Anyway, let's thank the Lord and then we'll split. Father in heaven, thank you for this time. Pray that you would grant us again a godly balance as we think about these different sins. Pray that you would clean up our own hearts, make us quick to confess our own sins and run away from them. Please help us to keep short accounts, and then please help us to live this way in the midst of our students. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.